I bet you don't know what a vestigial is. Well, a vestigial is a body part or structure that has lost its original function over the course of evolution, but still remains in the organism. And these structures were once useful for their ancestors, but now are reduced or imperfectly developed. Some really good examples in humans are the appendix, mine's been removed, wisdom teeth also removed, and even the coccyx, the remnants of an old tail that us humans used to have. But some of my most favorite examples are in animals, like kiwi, the flightless bird that just runs around screaming its head off. Horse chestnuts. If you don't know what horse chestnuts, go look it up and you're gonna wanna go peel one off, or it'd be the most horrifying thing you've ever seen. And my personal favorite, whale hips. From a time when whales used to walk on land, they needed hips to walk, but now they're exclusively in the ocean. They're completely useless. Their hip bones basically just float in their body, not really attached to anything, and are never really used for anything, except on rare occasions. Once a year on the full moon, all the male whales rise to the surface of the ocean, stick their whale bones out, and shake their and a mating call for all the female whales. Just kidding, that's not even remotely true. But now you'll have a nice little imagery to forever remember what a vestigial is, because it's important for this video, because you'd be shocked at how many vestigial things are part of your everyday life and especially part of your attire. And just like those animals, the history of mock toe boots goes back way further than people think. You know, a lot of people think that mock toe boots were invented in the 50s or 60s, and don't get me wrong, they don't go back millions and millions of years like whales, but they do go back hundreds and hundreds of years. Predating the Europeans' discovery of the Americas, the natives were wearing moccasins of various kinds for hundreds and hundreds of years, which basically remained unchanged, even compared to some of the oldest footwear ever discovered, dating back thousands of years, where early humans basically just took a piece of animal skin, wrapped it around the bottom of their feet, and tied it right down the front of their foot. And that's how native shoes were made leading up to the 1800s. And even before then, people had found the value of soft, flexible moccasins, dating back to their adoption by some of the earliest explorers in the Americas. But these moccasins were just not cut out for these extremely long treks, these long weeks trapping, doing jobs like river driving, logging, even your average outdoorsman and adventurer. So brands that started making these moccasins in the late 1800s started to realize that there was a need for a hybrid of the heavy and rigid European style footwear with the flexible and comfortable moccasins to make the first version of the true moccasin boot, or the mock toe boot. And that's where we hit the golden era of moccasin boots. Because by 1910, with the invention of the overlap stitch by Russell Moccasins, it became one of the boots of choice for people like King Edward VIII, Charles Lindbergh with his historic solo nonstop transatlantic flight, and plenty of other famous explorers and adventurers. And because of those explorers and the usefulness of these boots, it caused this style to explode in popularity. And by the 1920s, moccasin boots like Russell's and J.H. Bass were sold across the United States, even with Russell being in Abercrombie & Fitch. It was a different brand back then, don't worry. And around this time, with the Industrial Revolution in full swing, the responsibilities that had changed for the average person. People started working in factories, mill workers, steel workers, construction workers, and people started to realize that these boots that were kind of made for hunters and adventurers, they were the perfect boot for all these new jobs. And during this time, basically every moccasin boot on the market was a true moccasin construction, paying homage to the original moccasins that wrapped underneath your foot and then on top of your foot, giving you that seamless sidewall, that sock-like feeling underneath your foot, no hard edges or lips to give you blisters or make you sore. And they worked. They were adopted by workers and everyone and adventurers because they were durable, comfortable, repairable, so much so that the mock toe boot became synonymous with comfort and quality. If you saw this mock toe stitch on the toe, you knew you were getting a moccasin boot that had everything that people loved about moccasin boots in it. And all this popularity forced these once small shops to meet the growing demand of this new age. And with that increased demand and an aging Mr. Russell, he sold his remaining shares and interest in Russell Moccasins in 1926 to G.H. Bass, which turned out to be the perfect timing for this, because just a couple years later, the US would see its greatest economic downturn of all time, the Great Depression, where GDP would drop nearly in half in just a matter of a few years. And it really did affect these businesses, because in 1930, sales of Russell boots dropped by 2/3, which brought them to the brink of devastation and almost had to close their doors, until Sears and Roebuck came in clutch and saved the brand by putting in a big order that just barely made Russell survivable. But it wasn't just the Great Depression that made these boots almost go extinct. It was the fact that they're very expensive and very labor intensive to make. And in an era of rapidly growing mass production through the 20s and 30s, this style of handmade products is usually the first one that goes. So a lot of these footwear brands were trying to find a way to make moccasin boots faster and easier. And someone finally figured out how to do it. Because it wasn't until someone at G.H. Bass realized that they could just put this little mock toe stitch on a regular boot, and it would look exactly like a moccasin boot. You could call it something similar to a moccasin boot, and the average consumer might not know the difference between an authentic, true, traditional moccasin boot and a moccasin boot. And they were right, because if you read this article, this comes straight from a G.H. Bass pamphlet that the guys at Russell Moccasins tracked down. So recent years have seen a much larger recognition of the advantages of moccasins and great increase in their popularity. Very naturally, a large variety of footwear has also appeared having more or less the outward resemblance of a moccasin, but which is constructed upon entirely different methods. Some of these are called by names that frankly indicate that they are imitation moccasins. Others are not so frank. In construction, most of them are simply Goodyear welt shoes with uppers cut along the lines of a moccasin, right here and right here, bringing a seam around the forepart at the top of the foot, right here. It's a very complex way to describe a mock toe seam. And now you can see that at the time, it wasn't just G.H. Bass, you know, because G.H. Bass was like, at least we're saying that they're mock moccasins. Some of these brands out here started making these too, and they're not even claiming they're mock moccasins. They're just saying they're true moccasins. And that is where the waters began to be muddied with all these mock moccasin boots. And it got to the point where the consumer was confused about the true meaning of a mock toe stitch, to a point where it was no longer this sign of true quality and you can only get this with a moccasin style boot. It slowly just became almost like a symbol of quality, but more importantly, a style feature. Meanwhile, Russell Moccasins and some of these other brands stayed true to the tradition, and from 1930s to the 1940s, true moccasins were still well loved and worn by the people who needed them the most. But the moccasin could not be stopped, and soon giants in the industry like Red Wing with their 877 classic mock toe boot was released in 1952, the Thorogood Boy Scout boot in 1964, even the Alden 405 in the 1960s. And just about every other famous mock toe boot that you're aware of came from this era. And this is that same era that all of these wedge sole boots started popping up. And that's where you get that classic imagery of these steel workers 100 feet up in the air, no safety equipment whatsoever except for the boots on their feet. But as far as I can tell, all those famous mock toe boots at the time with the Red Wings, the Thorogoods, even the Aldens were not true moccasins. I think they were all mock moccasins. And so as these styles continue to grow in popularity, culture once again forgot more and more what a true moccasin was and what this mock toe represented, and slowly started to forget about the brands that started it all. But there was a handful of the most hardcore devoted brands that refused to give up and found niche markets individually that would still demand enough to keep their businesses alive, to grow their businesses, and they really tried to find those industries that could benefit from the values you can only get from a true moccasin construction. But it got to the point in 2025 where 99% of the boots and shoes with a mock toe stitch are not true moccasin construction. And if you ask people on the street, people that have these boots, people that wear boots, what is this mock toe stitch for? Most people have no idea that this mock toe stitch was a vestigial part of this true moccasin boot from over 100 years ago. And it's not just this mock toe stitch, it's also this little side stitch here, because that whole bottom wraps all the way underneath, and that's why you see it even in the 877 right here. This has no value whatsoever here. It's just aesthetic to make it look like this. That stitch is about as useful as whale hips. So as a way to tell this story and show you exactly what the original wedge sole moccasin boots were and how they worked, I convinced Russell to make the famous mock toe boots. The boot that started it all, that started the whole trend, but then was forgotten. They made me the OG, the original, the mock daddy of them all, the original wedge sole work boot. So now let's cut these in half and I'll show you what a real mock toe boot is supposed to look like from the inside. And after 5 years, I think it's been 5 years of Mocktober, out of all the popular mock toe boots that we cut, which ones are actually true moccasin construction? And how can you tell the difference if you don't want to cut them in half? And at the end of the series, because we're cutting apart all the big US Moccasin mocks to really figure out which one of these guys stayed true to their values, who's still doing it the way they used to, and who sold their literal souls to the margin gods. So let's cut them in half. Product update with the boot breakers. So after some feedback from you guys, this was our original boot breaker material, just some veg tan, but it's a little too smooth on top. We decided to go with slightly adjusted leather where we got a little bit of a buff top. So come on over here. Now you can see the difference between the old 5mm versus the new. And the nice thing about these is they take up room inside your boots. So if you got a boot that's too big or you want a shoe that feels more like a true heritage boot, you just throw one of these in there and it solves all your problems. They don't stink to this veg tan. Don't forget we also have our regular foam boot breakers with the big thick mattresses in the green, the medium thickness in the blue, and the OG boot breakers at 2 millimeters. These are the ones that really started this whole thing, where we just made a little insole you can slide in any Heritage boot without changing the size. It's just 2 millimeters thick. Give you a little bit of squish, help you break in the boots, and you can keep them in the boots if you want. That's where the whole name boot breaker came from. So that's it for the product update. Product update. All right, we got them cut in half, and if you're not subscribed, consider pushing that subscribe button, push that like button, because Russell really put a lot of time and energy, not just into the designing and making of these boots, but also into the history and the research and digging through all the archives to really try to figure out the history of this, because there's not much information out there. So this was a very big project for Russell, so huge shout out to them, and thank you guys for supporting this video and supporting Russell and helping, honestly, keep this old school true moccasin boot alive. So now, let's see what's inside. So now you can really see the difference between a true moccasin construction compared to all the other Mocktober mocks that we've cut apart. And that biggest difference is that seamless sidewall, how it really does start underneath your foot and wrap around versus your more traditional Goodyear welt construction. You've got that insole, and then the upper tucks down and around the bottom and then stops and doesn't wrap underneath your foot and is tied in right there. That is the biggest difference between these functionally. And now you can even see how that leather that wraps underneath your foot also wraps up along the sidewall and is sewn in here. And that's why you see this exact stitch line on the Thoroughgoods. This is literally just whale hips. You see it on the 877s, whale hips. You even see it in some non-Moc-toe boots that still have that cross stitch line right there. And out of all the Moc-toes we've cut apart, here's all the Moc-toes, and here are the very few real moccasins. Isn't that crazy how so few true moccasins still exist today, when basically all the iconic, all the classic boots are a fake Moc-toe? And that's not to say that this is bad, you should never buy this, and this is a shame to buy a fake Moc-toe boot, because it's part of what keeps it alive, but it's also taken on a life of its own. These boots are some of the most classic, some of the most stylish, some of the most loved boots of all time. And it's not to say that, oh, you should never wear them. This is, what this video is a love letter to moccasin boots, to Moc-toe boots, to the whole history, to the whole lineage. Because you shouldn't leave this video thinking like, oh dang, all my Moc-toe boots are fake, I'm embarrassed to wear them. This is a video to educate you and inform you so that you have some cool talking points to talk to your friends, so you understand the history of what you're actually wearing every day, to understand where all these little features and attributes and the components all come from, because there is a rich history behind it. It's not just, oh, someone in 2022 decided to throw this on and that on. It's like every single aspect of these boots comes from the functionality that had to be imbued into these kind of boots, because at the time they were a tool, they're a piece of equipment. You made your life, your living, you put food on the table for your kids with this style of boot. And it's cool that even to this day, you can buy tons and tons of boots with this Moc-toe style. But it's even cooler that somehow, after all these years, through all the ups and downs, you can still get the original Moc-toe wedge sole work boot made by Russell, who is one of the brands that started it all. And it's crazy to me how close this style of boot came to completely dying out and going extinct, to a point where all you had left was these vestigial parts of the Moc-toe stitch and this little sidewall stitch. And if there's one foolproof way of figuring out if any of your Moc-toe boots are a true moccasin construction, all you have to do is lightly pull that away to the side, and if it looks like the leather continues to wrap underneath, it might be a moccasin. If you see stitches and it ends right there and you see all the stitches from the Goodyear welt, it's probably not a true moccasin. But for sure, if you put your hand inside of the boot and you feel this little lip there, you don't feel that seamless transition, that's one of your best indicators it's not a true moccasin. So now you should know exactly which boots of yours are real Moc-toes and which ones are not, what the true history and lineage and value of a moccasin boot actually is. And now you can flex on your friends and point down on their boots and like, you got whale hips on your feet, bro. So thank you guys for watching, and thanks again to Russell for doing all this and helping us with the research. And if you're watching this after the launch and they're all sold out, I'll try my best to convince Russell to do another batch, but a lot lot of times these are just a one-off project to tell a unique story and have a little piece of history that you can actually wear every day. And now you have an unfortunate image forever in your head of whales rising to the surface and twerking on the water to find themselves a mate, which is not true. So thank you guys. See ya.
I'm a heritage boy. Mom,
I'm grown up. I wear fancy clothes. What is a vestigial